I am humbled to sit here before you. The work that Jasmine and I get to do every day is in many ways a sacred act. In my specific context, I get to work with adults and students in classrooms every day, and that means that a parent has entrusted me with their child. Education for me is probably the most sacred work that anyone could ever ask anyone to do, because you get to hold someone for a few hours a day, but you get to change someone a largo plazo, right, long term. So I take my job very serious, and for me the term teacher really means student, because there is a reciprocity between what I do and what I learn from the students with whom I work. So the t-shirts that you have an image on them. I want you to take a minute and look at the image on your t-shirts, and it's an image of an artboard. And so I'm from New York City, but I recently moved to Miami. I was just telling Jasmine about that experience. And Miami has a lot of hurricanes, right? So it's a very different climate from maybe what some of you are used to here. It's like La Selva Tropical, right? It's a tropical rainforest. So we're always prepping for hurricanes over the summer. And one of the things that happens during a hurricane is you get to see which trees have the strongest roots. And many times trees fall over. But most trees stand their ground. And so Jasmine and I want to start off with just a question to you that we would love for you to consider sharing with the thinking partners, your colleagues, your peers at your table. When we say the word roots, right, we're taking the idea of trees having roots. What would you think your roots to be? What would you consider your roots? There's no wrong answer to that question. So to kind of get us started and warmed up with those of you at your table, what would you identify your roots to be? How do you interpret that word? We're going to ask you to turn and talk for maybe a minute or two, get our brains warmed up for our conversation, and then we will continue. Please turn around. One more minute. Find your last sentence. Find your last word. Okay, thank you. So let's bring it back to a one mic. Thank you for listening with your eyes, your ears, and your hearts. I'm going to pose the question to Jasmine now and give her the floor so that we can learn from her experience. So Jasmine, please take it away.
Okay, so thank you so much, Mario, for that opening. It was really beautiful and it was very thoughtful. And so I think my response to the question of what are my roots or what do I think of when we say what are your roots, for sure I thought about growing up on the reservation in the Pueblo, which is a very rural part of New Mexico. It's about an hour away from here, a little over an hour away from here. And so growing up, I always knew I was Native American. I knew that we were Pueblo, which was like a very specific type of Native American, right? And that we were very unique in that way, that we have so much of our culture and of our language still intact today, like pre-Columbus ceremonial, traditions that go way back before even Columbus arriving to the west or whatever, and to the North America. But growing up, I also knew that there was a part of me that wasn't Pueblo, it wasn't Native American, that my dad is half African American and half Native, and so I always knew too that I was biracial, and that I was unique in that sense, and it didn't affect me in any way, I guess, growing up until I was in high school, and when I really started to want to learn more about that part of me, because I grew up in the Pueblo, I was exposed to the language. My family were fluent Toa speakers. That's the language that we speak in Toa, and we're the only ones that speak it in the whole entire world. And so, yeah, I really embraced learning more about my, my African American roots, and I was a part of a West African dance group in high school, and I felt like that was just like a part of me that I just really celebrated, wanted to celebrate more of like who I was, another part of me. So I think, that describes like my answer to that question.
So for me, it was I was really lost as a young boy. My mother was born in Puerto Rico in the 50s, and my father was born in Cuba around the same time. And they both ended up in New York because there was a huge migration from the Caribbean area to many parts of the United States, but particularly to the eastern coast. Many of the major cities on the eastern coast of the United States received a huge influx of Latinos, specifically from the Caribbean area. And so my mother and my father ended up in New York City in high school, and they fell in love. Unfortunately, my mother's mother, my abuela, Libertad Guerra was her name. Libertad Guerra would be Liberty War. So imagine your name being Liberty War. It's an interesting name. Libertad did not approve of my mother being with my father, because in Libertad's eyes, this was a Cuban who was going nowhere, who did not bring any assets to her daughter. And so my grandmother had a different idea of who my mother should have married. My grandmother wanted my mother to marry a white man. She wanted her to marry a white man because to my grandmother that represented security. She wanted my mother to marry a white man because in my grandmother's eyes, a white man equaled success, or being married or associated with whiteness equaled success. And so those messages were clear. But my mother was also a revolucionaria, right? She went against the grain. She did not listen. And so she stood with my father. And had my brother and I, so I do have Puerto Rican roots, I also have Cuban roots, but they're firmly Caribbean roots. And I do identify as an Afro-Latino because I know that the influence of the slave trade, right, we brought up Columbus, the slave trade was real, and so there were many African roots that were planted in the New World, as they termed it back then. So I don't consider myself just a Latino, I consider myself an Afro-Latino. And feel that because of my Cuban and Puerto Rican sides. Unfortunately, my mother succumbed to the temptation of wanting to live in an affluent neighborhood and wanting to make sure that her kids had access through money, essentially. And she ended up leaving my father, ended up marrying a white Jewish man. So I grew up in a very rich neighborhood, and I was the first Latino, we were the first Latino family to move into my neighborhood, to move into my building specifically. So I was thrust into a very different cultural world at a very young age, and I felt the color of my skin very, very much. I felt the texture of my hair very, very much. I felt the sound of my voice was different because I spoke in two languages, and many of those with whom I went to school with did not speak like me, sound like me, did not have the same color of skin as me. And so I had to find ways to feel like I had a place at the table, like I had a right to know myself. And I was very lost at times because of that. So I guess my answer to the roots question is, it wasn't until I became a teenager where I started to read more about my roots. And in my specific case, it would be the story of the Taíno. For those of you that are familiar with that term, the indigenous people that Columbus came across in the specific context of the Caribbean. And so I read up on my Latinaje, but even more importantly on my Taíno roots. And the reason why we're bringing up this question is because one of the purposes of education in my specific context, and Jasmine, I want to hear what you have to say about this. The purpose of education is not to teach you something necessarily. It's to understand what your role is in the world. And so if you think that by learning something, you're going to be able to confront inequity, then you found your purpose. Right? For me, I think the whole point of being a teacher and being a student is to be able to learn as much as you can about how the world works by making sure that you understand your roots. You should never compromise what your roots are. And so imagine the last book that you read, imagine the last book that your teacher read with you. Whose story was being told in that book? Right? Whose story had a right to be told, and whose stories were not being told? And so if I leave anything with you and you go back to your classrooms, I want you to ask your teachers, whose stories are we listening to? And whose stories are we excluding? Because everyone's story has a right to be told. And I'll end there and maybe we can continue. So, Jasmine, what languages do you speak?
So I speak Toa, which is the language that that I grew up with in my home, which is a language that we speak in Jemez. And then I also, obviously I speak English. I learned a little bit of Spanish in high school, and then in college I was this close to double majoring in French, and so I know enough French to probably listen to it being spoken and understand it, but I wouldn't be able to speak it as best as I could, at least in college.
Well, the reason why I bring it up is because one of the blessings of being able to navigate this world is being multilingual. And unfortunately, we live in a bubble. Many people have forced an English-only orientation to people of color. And so I have a lot of friends who are Latinos who don't know how to speak Spanish. And this whole idea of what it is to be a real Latino comes up all the time. Because if you can't cook pork, some people think you're not a real Latino. Or if you don't eat tostones, right, which are plantains, you're not a real Latino. Or for me, if you don't eat aguacate, if you don't like avocado on every single plate that you eat, you're probably not a real Latino. And in many ways, the language that you speak really dictates what your identity is around who you are. So my mother understood that once I was going to go into the American education schooling system, they weren't going to teach me Spanish. They were going to teach me English. They were going to force English. And I remember the first day I went to kindergarten, I said, "Hola, maestra." And she said, "We say good morning." And immediately I felt that my language was being colonized. Because she had an idea of what success was too. Very much like my grandmother. We speak English when we come to school. You can leave Spanish for home. And so the messages around Spanish, and I imagine and there may be similar stories around other indigenous languages or home languages, is that that has no place in school, or there isn't an intellectual academic version of your language, or you would not be successful if we practice your language. But the reality is that more than 50% of the entire world is bilingual. But only 10% of the people in the United States have a passport. And so your language is you. Your language is a deep part of you. Cuando mi mamá me hablaba en español, esperaba que le respondiera en español. Y when she spoke to me in English, she expected me to respond in English. And if I responded, when she spoke to me in Spanish and I responded in English, she would shake her chancleta. And she would hold it up like, what did you say? And I didn't understand why she did it at the time, but she was preparing me for the world that I was going to go in. She's like, everyone is going to question who you are. They're gonna tell you that your brown skin is not pretty or is less than. They're gonna judge you by the texture of your hair. They're gonna say, don't speak Spanish here. We speak English. So she knew that I was going to go into an unjust world, and she prepared me. She gave me this kind of cultural armor. And so I want to send that message to you.
Yeah, and I'm speaking on that note, preparing. I feel like, our family's preparing us for the outside world, that it's going to be more brutal, right, than what you're living in your household. And I think at least for my family and my background, being Native, we were very much prepared that no one's going to cut you a break, that you have to learn both. And like, it was very interesting. I mean, it's different from what you were saying, because maybe your mom really forced English on you, right? Because she really wanted you to have that access or have that kind of treatment, get the treatment that she wanted from the outside world. And for a lot of, I think, Natives, and at least for the Pueblos, I think, what we hear at home, at least for me and my family, and I hear this with my friends too, is that we're really expected to excel in both worlds, right? Is what we hear for our indigenous people, that you can't forget where you come from. You can't forget your language. You have to learn your language so that you can have that knowledge, right? Because language is knowledge. Language is access to the culture. Because when you don't have the language, you only get so far in knowing your culture, and you only get so far in knowing your history, because language is just so integral to identity and to culture that you can't have one without the other. You have to be continuously learning both. And so I was expected to speak Towa at home, and Towa in our religious and cultural areas. Like, we have plazas in our Pueblos, and in the plaza you speak your language. You speak only what your indigenous language is, and it's a matter of respect. You're doing it out of respect, right, for your ancestors, for those who gifted you that language, and those who have who died really for that privilege for us to continue to speak it today. It's a blessing. And so I really struggled with wanting to be pushed, because my mother, kind of the same thing as you, she forced me to attend a very affluent high school here in Albuquerque, which is Sandia Preparatory School. It's a private school, and I didn't really know why at first, but once I entered that realm and being very othered, you're realizing that you are different, and that you're maybe somewhat not at the level as these other kids who are coming from way different backgrounds than you, pretty much white privilege background. You tend to second guess. Oh, well, what am I doing here? Why do I have to live on the reservation? I should live in the city. I should speak and dress the way that my classmates dress, and it was a very confusing time for me too. But once I grew up and started realizing more about our history as indigenous people, as minority people, when you are learning about that and all of the discrimination, the injustices, and the atrocities that happen, you almost begin to think, wow, like how am I contributing to the loss of language, to the loss of culture? And what am I doing to be a more enlightened person, right? And so I think then that's when I started to really push back against my family and started becoming angry with my family for kind of pushing me out there to say, no, you're smart, you're well-to-do, you can do it. We expect you to be perfect in both. And it was just more so like, wow, that's impossible. How can somebody be so perfect with both, cultures? But I think that we have a lot of us out there that can prove that they can kind of function in a balanced way, that they can be extremely articulate in English and be highly intellectual people and do just such amazing work that, you are doing and people that I know are doing. But yet still hold true to those roots and where they came from, and decide that I'm not going to put that aside, or I'm not going to hide that part of my identity. I'm going to celebrate it. I'm going to speak my language. I'm going to participate in the culture when I go home. I'm going to, participate in ceremonies. I actually live on the reservation now, and I drove like an hour and 15 minutes to be here this morning. And a lot of people will ask, well, why do you still live there? Well, because I have two small children. I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I want them to learn the language. I want them to be immersed in that culture. I wouldn't even think of anywhere else that I would want my daughters to grow up in. And I think it's those choices that we make, right? It's the choices that we decide. Who are we going to surround ourselves with, and what morals, I guess, and what builds your character. And a lot of it comes down to language and culture too, I think. Yeah.
Let's do a poll. I'm going to say a statement, and if it pertains to you, I'd like for you to stand up. I'm just going to do a silent stand. So who in the room, please stand if this statement pertains to you, feels that your culture is represented in what you're learning in your classroom? Please stand. Is your culture being represented currently in your classroom? This will be a silent activity. We're just going to see how many people stand up. And speak your truth. Okay, so as we're standing, now I want us to look at the room, scan the room. So the people who are standing feel that their cultures are adequately being represented in the classroom. Okay, thank you. Please sit. That's real. Not everybody stood up, and that's real. The second question that we want to ask is, who here speaks at least 2 languages? Please stand. Okay. And all of these definitions about what it means to really speak 2 languages, right? So I'm going to change the statement. Who here has tried to speak more than 1 language? Who's tried to learn a word or a phrase? Let's make it a little bit more equitable, right? So maybe some people here. There are some people sitting who are like, I'm not trying to learn any other languages right now. Like, leave me alone, Mario. Okay, take a look at the room, those who stood up. Okay? And take a look at those who did not. And that's real too. Please sit. Thank you for speaking your truth. So let's just kind of push a pin to the messages we're trying to send here. So you absolutely deserve to have your culture represented in what you're learning. And if you feel that you're not, you have a voice. So you should feel like you have a voice to speak to your teacher, to speak to your principal about the content that you're being taught through. And you absolutely have a right to learn more than 1 language. And if that's something that you want to do, you should really claim that space. Jasmine mentioned a lot of the social cultural benefits of being bilingual or multilingual. There's cognitive benefits, right? It offsets dementia, right, when you're older. There are economic benefits. You can literally make more money. Many of the Fortune 500 companies are looking for multilingual people, and because we've been dealing with years of English-only schooling, they're outsourcing, and they're finding people for their jobs in other countries who are multilingual. So we just want you to make sure what you have a right to, that you know that. Yeah, please.
So Mario is really reminding me of, I don't know how many of you know about the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. Raise your hand. Oh, okay, cool. Some people. So I have, where I work at the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty with the Native American Budget and Policy Institute, and I'm a policy analyst on education policy that directly affects the lives of Native American students and children and families. And the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit is encompassing exactly everything we are talking about right now. It's encompassing, it's saying to our state, to our legislators, to our government, our state government, that in New Mexico, that in order to have a sufficient public education in New Mexico, we have to be teaching bilingual education. We have to have bilingual education, and we also have to be encompassing and holding up the New Mexico Hispanic Education Act, which has a lot of great things in it. It says that needs to be given to our Hispanic students, and it also holds up the Bilingual Multicultural Act, which is really encompassing multiculturalism in the classrooms, multilingualism in our curriculum and in our classrooms, and then lastly, the Native American New Mexico Indian Education Act, and which actually says in it that the preservation and maintenance of Native American languages is a priority of New Mexico. And so it's so amazing that we have in this state such thoughtful and inclusive laws on our books, right? But it's more so about us in these rooms right now, you as students, to really make that happen in your classrooms, because we know that maybe it's not happening. We know that there's a lawsuit out there that's saying, no, our New Mexico, our schools actually haven't been following these laws and haven't really been engaging in this curriculum. And maybe some of you are very lucky, and I noticed all of you from Zuni stood up when you said, when Maria asked the question if your culture is reflected in your schools. And I think that that's where we're heading. I think that we're heading in this state and as a country to be more inclusive and to celebrate our culture and to celebrate our languages. And I just want to applaud all of you for being here today and taking the time and listening to us and engaging with your peers. I think that you all are probably going to see each other at other points in your lives when you are working in your future professions, and really continuing this conversation and being protectors of these types of privileges, because it's a gift. Everything that we have, that we're talking about and that you're going to talk about today, is a gift, and you are all so incredibly blessed. And I hope that you continue this type of work and protect these languages and these cultures and these heritage that you come from, and continue to be proud young people and grow up to be proud adults who raise proud children and continue, and that continues. So I just wanted to share that with you all, and I think our time is like coming up.
One last thing, take out your phone or something to write with, and can you spell the name of that you just mentioned, the court case?
Oh, yes.
So take out a phone, you're going to text this to yourself. I'm going to give you homework. Or if you want to write this name down, or write this information down, how do you spell that?
So Yazzie is spelled YAZZIE/Martinez, MARTINEZ, versus State of New Mexico. And I'm just going to put my little plug in here, because I work for the coalition that works of all these community groups that are working towards this lawsuit. We have a student coalition that's forming, and we have, this is a movement, everybody. This is such a time to be in New Mexico, to be a young person in New Mexico, and especially a young bilingual student, multilingual student, which I'm sure some of you are. And I invite you all to visit the Transform Education New Mexico website. That's the coalition website, and get involved. And come talk to me after. I can give you more information about it.
Thank you for speaking your truth and knowing your roots, and have an excellent rest of your day. Muchísimas gracias.